Enjoy.
Yeah.
The fourth part of this adventure serial can be seen at the same time, that's 4:45, next Wednesday afternoon. Tomorrow afternoon, because of World Cup coverage, children's programmes will be shown on BBC2. That's apart from Play School, which you can see here on BBC1 at 3:40. Then on BBC2 at 4:05, there's a cartoon film based on a Russian fairy story, The Humpbacked Pony. And at 5:10, Johnny Ball invites you to think again as he discovers the fun behind the facts of energy, where it comes from and where it goes. So that's on BBC2 tomorrow afternoon. In just over 5 minutes, Wild Track. And before that on BBC1, we join Paul McDowell for Newsround.
Still no peace for the trapped refugees of war-torn Beirut. Hello. There's been more heavy fighting around the capital of Lebanon, Beirut. Thousands of refugees who fled there from earlier fighting in southern Lebanon are once again at risk. Israeli forces have about 6,000 Palestinian fighters surrounded in West Beirut, while both sides await the results of talks. A peace plan put forward by America to take the Palestinian fighters away from Beirut has been rejected by both sides. Israel is demanding that there should be a total withdrawal of all the Palestinian forces, leaving not even a small number of representatives there. Chris Morris now reports.
Israeli shells rain down on West Beirut. This was the 5th time the ceasefire's broken down, bringing panic to the streets of the city. Israel was keeping up the pressure against the beleaguered PLO. Some of the missiles were fired from Israeli gunboats patrolling just offshore. Other shells fired by tanks in the hills overlooking West Beirut set apartment buildings ablaze. There's no doubt this area is at the mercy of the Israelis, and they've shown none whenever PLO guerrillas have risked firing at their positions. 500,000 civilians are now trapped inside West Beirut because of the fighting and Israel's blockade. Many have been forced to flee from their own homes and have taken refuge in apartment buildings in the city center. But there's still no electricity or water, and families are having to live in appalling conditions. Many Lebanese and Palestinian families now live outdoors, a miserable existence. But after years of civil war and now the Israeli invasion, they're resilient people. Thousands of tons of fly-blown rubbish now litter West Beirut, bringing with it the threat of the outbreak of disease such as typhoid and cholera. The people try to cope in this squalor as best they can, but it's a losing battle.
London schools with swimming pools have been issued with a fresh warning about the dangers posed by the chemicals used for cleaning the water. This follows the accident at an East London pool yesterday when 15 children were taken to hospital. The 2 kept in overnight were allowed home this morning. An inquiry is still going on into why the accident happened. The Inner London Education Authority is looking at ways of improving the safety regulations in their swimming pools. The crew of a task force frigate who risked their lives saving others have come home. HMS Arrow sailed into Plymouth today. Like many of the ships and soldiers home from the South Atlantic, she has a tale of bravery to tell. The ship risked all when she went alongside the first major casualty on the British side, the stricken HMS Sheffield, on fire after a missile attack. Sandy Marshall watched the homecoming.
HMS Arrow moved into Plymouth Sound badly battered from her role in rescuing survivors from HMS Sheffield. She was accompanied by a flotilla of small boats that turned out to welcome the first casualty of the Falklands conflict. And she still bore the scars, holes caused by cannon fire, 30mm shells fired by guns on Mirage fighters. She was attacked while British troops were carrying out their bombardment of Port Stanley airfield, but she more than settled the score. The sides of her gun record what she, in turn, claims to have destroyed. The crew hadn't anticipated the warmth of their reception, but they had asked for appropriate air cover. The Red Arrow's display team is twinned with the ship that bears its name, but for the crew, the formal welcomes and ceremonies took second place to the families they'd left behind.
A pipeline that will link Russian gas fields with homes and factories in West Germany is at the centre of an international row. The pipeline, over 1,600 miles long, will supply gas from Siberia in Russia to West Germany, and it's fuel the Germans say they badly need. But across the Atlantic, the American government want to block the deal. They don't want the Germans to trade with the Russians because of the support the Russians have given to the harsh regime in Poland. Tim Sebastian now reports.
The problem begins here in Siberia. There's enough gas to last for decades, and it could make the Russians the fortune they badly need. If America succeeds in restricting supplies of equipment, it might hold up the project for several years. The result, more drain on the weak Soviet economy. But the Germans in particular don't want to be caught up in a row between Washington and Moscow. Their border with the communist states has made them highly sensitive to trouble like that. They want to supply the equipment to the Russians because they want to stay friendly with them. Any tension between them could put at risk many economic and political deals. They fear that all that and much more could suffer because of America's latest moves. Britain, too, has a similar interest. The John Brown engineering firm in Scotland has a valuable contract with the Russians involving a large number of jobs. They have no wish to see the Americans spoil the deal, nor has the British government. So what started as a normal trade agreement has blossomed into a major international dispute. The effects of that could last long after the pipeline does eventually get built.
An important group of Britain's doctors want professional boxing to be banned in this country. The British Medical Association decided today that boxing should be forbidden because it can cause damage to the eyes, the brain, and even cause death. The doctors heard that in the past 40 years, about 350 people have died because of boxing injuries. Professional boxing has already been banned in Norway and Sweden, but boxing in schools wouldn't be affected by the proposed ban. Just one day after the England team returned home from the World Cup, they have a new manager. He's Bobby Robson, the manager of First Division Ipswich Town. As a player, Robson, on the left, played for England 20 times. In his 13 years as manager of Ipswich, he has helped to establish this small country club at the forefront of English football. His first great triumph came 4 years ago when the team beat Arsenal in the FA Cup. Because of Ipswich's many triumphs, Robson has been offered several new jobs, but he's always turned them down before. Well, finally, still with soccer, the Liverpool team have lost the support of one of their most loyal fans. Polly, a parrot, was runner-up in last year's Talking Bird Championships by chanting Liverpool slogans. Now she's suddenly changed sides. Her owners report that she is singing for Everton, Liverpool's arch-rivals. They think her seed has been doctored by Everton fans. But Polly's still a bit confused. Sometimes she says Everpool. Well, that's it for tonight. We'll be back, but on BBC2 tomorrow night at the same time. Until then, bye-bye.
Now, live on BBC1, here's Wild Track.
Right, no mucking about this week. We're off to the seaside. Sue and I have been paddling. Again.
There are 2,750 miles of shoreline around Britain. Sandy beaches, estuaries, shingle and rocky beaches, such as Wembury on the Devon coast.
And on all those...
That's all for this programme, and I'm afraid for the series. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll be back for another series soon. Until then, bye-bye.
Goodbye.
This year, to mark the Silver Jubilee of the BBC Natural History Unit, the BBC is producing a limited issue of commemorative covers designed by Gordon Benningfield. The cost is £5 per cover, and cheques or postal orders should be made payable to BBC Enterprises Limited and sent to NHU Commemorative Cover, PO Box 253, Bristol, BS 99 7LD. Well, that ends children's programmes for today. They begin again tomorrow afternoon at 3:40 on BBC1, followed by all the others from 4:05 on BBC2, which now offers A Night at the Pictures, looking back at the first 40 years of the British cinema. That's on BBC2 now.
South East at 6 after the news includes the second of this week's reports from Oxford and looks at the plight of the city's forgotten generation, the young unemployed. West Ham footballer Trevor Brooking, on his return from Spain, gives his view of England's future under Bobby Robson. The row over the demolition of Kensington Town Hall goes on amidst rumours of new uses for the site. And a touch of Fat Swallow from George Chisholm and the Hefty Jazz Band as they finish their 100th concert. That's South East at 6 after the news. Then later tonight at 8:30, a new series of Now Get Out of That. Two unsuspecting teams, one from Oxford and one from Cambridge, embark on a 24-hour ordeal filled with improbable tasks and uncomfortable situations. Follow the ups and downs of part one of Now Get Out of That, tonight at 8:30 on BBC1.
And now on BBC1 at 5:40, the evening news with Richard Baker.
Police seize a Rolls-Royce full of forged banknotes and uncover millions more. British Rail say it's almost certain they'll run a service next week. Back home, the ship that went to the help of the stricken destroyer Sheffield. And it's confirmed Bobby Robson is England's new soccer manager. Police have seized £5.5 million in forged £20 notes in two separate halls in South London. They believe some notes may have gone into circulation already, but are confident that the fraud has been, in their words, nipped in the bud. £500,000 was discovered packed in suitcases inside a gold Rolls-Royce in the Old Kent Road. The rest, worth £5 million, was found later in a transit van, along with false lithographic plates. John Thorne reporting.
The breakthrough came when Crime Squad and Currency Unit detectives stopped a gold-coloured Rolls-Royce on the Old Kent Road in South London. Inside, police found £500,000 in forged £20 notes. Later, in the same area, they stopped a transit van. And this time, inside, there was £5 million worth of £20 note forgeries and the counterfeit plates. The police say that although £20 forgeries are comparatively unusual, with the tourist season in full swing, they are being used much more often now. So far, 10 people arrested all over the country are helping police with their inquiries. The detective in charge of the investigation says the forgeries are extremely good ones. They've been passed over betting shop and tobacconist counters as far apart as Cardiff and Scotland, and there are still some hundreds in circulation.
At the miners' conference, the new coal board chairman, Mr. Norman Siddall, has again denied that there's a secret hit list of 30 pits which are destined for closure. But although he was given a polite reception, it became clear that many delegates did not believe him. From Inverness, Martin Aidney reports.
Welcome for the new coal board chairman, especially as Mr Scargill said it was one Yorkshireman greeting another. The last time the two had met formally, the union had walked out over the alleged hit list of pits. Today the chairman started with a warning not to frighten off the customers.
Our customers and potential customers have got to be persuaded to stay with coal and to convert to it. And how are we to do this? Certainly not by heedlessly pushing up the price of coal or threatening to cut off supplies. It is the cash from the customer that pays the wages in our industry.
He then referred to that secret hit list, denying again it existed.
Your areas know exactly which of their pits in the coalfield are in difficulty. They know the problems, they know the prospects. There is no mystery about it, and it is not my intention that there should ever be a mystery about it. If our two organisations have to have our differences, let us make sure that we argue on real issues.
But scarcely had Mr Siddall left when his view was being challenged from the very spot where he had spoken.
There is no list, they say. No list. But you get into the areas and you can get the list. There is no list. So each area is independent of the National Coal Board. I refuse to believe it. There is a list, but they won't produce it.
And I believe if our members are going to take action, it will be on the proposed list of closures that we all know are in the minds of the National Coal Board.
And let me say this, that the Kent miners are not for sale. The Kent miners are not whores to be used and then paid off. The traditions that Emily spoke about will be upheld, and we will advance the cause of the Kent miners, and we'll join with anybody in struggling and fighting the coal board to main out pits and keep our men in employment.
Well, if there is to be a new battle over pit closures, it could well be in Kent that the first skirmish takes place. There the board wants the partial closure of Snowdon Colliery. Today, a report from the executive suggesting industrial action, if that were to happen, was accepted. But we shall have to see what turns out.
With the train strike in its fourth day, British Rail say it's almost certain they'll carry on running a service next week too. The strike is costing them around £6 million a day because they're still paying staff not involved in the dispute. It had been thought BR would try to cut their losses and shut the railway network. A final decision will be taken by the board tomorrow. Today, a spokesman said they were encouraged by the growing number of services. Although by normal standards, only a few trains ran, 936 between midnight and 2 o'clock this afternoon. That's 28% up on yesterday. The rail strike has meant extra business for British Airways, who say 40% more people are using their Manchester to London shuttle. This report from Malcolm Balin.
For Manchester businessmen anxious to get to London, this is the age of the plane. Each day of the strike, over 1,000 people have crowded onto the 7 shuttles which fly to Heathrow and back. And each day, between 2 and 5 backup planes have been laid on to carry all the passengers. But if the strike has cost British Rail dear, it's expensive for the travellers. They're paying £40 to get to London, and that's twice the rail fare. The flight takes only 40 minutes, which is 4 times quicker than the train, and the shuttle hopes to keep at least some of the extra business that has come their way. With British Airways taking care of the commuter, it's been one of their busiest weeks since the service started nearly 2 years ago.
15 Labour MPs lent their support to ASLEF members picketing King's Cross Station in London this morning and described the demonstration as a symbolic picket of solidarity. Mr Tony Benn said a victory for ASLEF would also be a victory for the nurses, health service workers and the miners. Les Huckfield explained why ASLEF had parliamentary support.
The reason that we're pledged to support ASLEF is that we know that this dispute is not about flexible rosters, it's not about new working arrangements. This is a deliberate attempt on the part of the British Railways Board, backed by the Thatcher government, to smash this union.
The report of the inquiry into the pay of white-collar civil servants has broadly backed the government's view that the linking of their salaries to what's paid by commercial firms should now be ended. It was the government scrapping of the system which led to 5 months of industrial action last year. The inquiry said a new start should be made. Civil servants should be paid enough to recruit, retain and motivate them, that market forces and the needs of management should be taken into account, but that comparison with other organisations should play a less conclusive part. Union reaction has been angry. Mr. Alistair Graham, leader of the biggest of the civil service unions, said it provided no hope of stable industrial relations for the immediate future. At today's meeting of the National Economic Development Council, TUC representatives attacked yesterday's remarks by Sir Geoffrey Howe on the need for very low pay rises in the next pay round. Mr. Len Murray said the government was using unemployment to screw down wages, while Mr. Moss Evans of the transport workers said low pay settlements in some industries still led to men losing jobs. The government replied that maximising wage levels would only maximise unemployment. The American attempt to bring peace to the Middle East is in the balance this evening. First, the PLO leader Yasser Arafat apparently rejected the offer to send in the US 6th Fleet to help evacuate the Palestinian forces trapped in Beirut. And then a meeting of the Israeli cabinet rejected 2 of the 9 points in the American plan, those allowing a PLO political office to remain in Beirut and PLO military units to serve in the Lebanese army. Despite this, the Israeli government is said to remain optimistic about a diplomatic settlement. But as the talking went on, so did the exchanges of fire between Israeli troops and PLO forces in Beirut. Bill Hamilton watched the battle.
As the Israelis edge ever nearer to the Palestinian strongholds of West Beirut, their troops are beginning to get a closer view of the results of their month-long bombardment. No one can be sure what the next day will bring. Sometimes it's an artillery barrage, sometimes an uneasy peace settles over the city. There have been so many ceasefires in Beirut over the past month that few here draw little comfort from an uneasy lull in the fighting. Civilians are living on their nerves because no one can predict who will fire the next shot and from which direction it will come. Somehow it seemed inevitable. Within hours, the latest ceasefire had gone the way of all the others. Throughout the night and much of the morning, West Beirut was again under bombardment from land and sea. But the PLO were in constant action too, shelling Israeli positions in the east of the city close to the Green Line. Many are thought to have been killed as a result of the latest exchanges. It's all putting increasing pressure on those anxious to secure a diplomatic solution. Today, the Israeli cabinet met again in emergency session to discuss the American plan aimed at ending the siege and evacuating the 6,000-strong PLO force from the city. Despite the Palestinians' apparent lack of enthusiasm for the idea, the Israeli government remains optimistic. For the moment, the Israelis alone patrol the South Lebanon coast. What part the American 6th Fleet might yet play here is still uncertain.
Mrs. Thatcher flew to Rome today for talks with Italian government leaders. She was met at Rome airport by the Italian Prime Minister, Mr. Spadolini. It was a routine visit, one of the regular rounds of consultations which take place between EEC leaders. The Italian government is currently planning big cuts in public spending, similar to those adopted by Mrs. Thatcher in Britain. With Mrs. Thatcher was the Chancellor, Sir Geoffrey Howe, and Mr. Pym, the Foreign Secretary. The talks were wide-ranging, covering the Middle East and the controversial pipeline deal between the Soviet Union and Western Europe. The battle-scarred frigate HMS Arrow sailed into Plymouth Sound today, the latest task force ship home from the Falklands. It was Arrow that rushed to the aid of the destroyer HMS Sheffield when it was hit by an Exocet missile. She drew alongside to carry out emergency firefighting and, while under the constant threat of further attack, rescued more than 200 survivors. Sandy Marshall reports on the homecoming.
HMS Arrow moved into Plymouth Sound badly battered from her role in rescuing survivors from HMS Sheffield. She was accompanied by a flotilla of small boats that turned out to welcome the first casualty of the Falklands conflict. And she still bore the scars, holes caused by cannon fire, 30mm shells fired by guns on Mirage fighters. She was attacked while British troops were carrying out their bombardment of Port Stanley airfield, but she more than settled the score. The sides of her gun record what she, in turn, claims to have destroyed. The crew hadn't anticipated the warmth of their reception, but they had asked for appropriate air cover. The Red Arrows display team is twinned with the ship that bears its name. But for the crew, the formal welcomes and ceremonies took second place to the families they'd left behind. The average age of the Arrows crew is just 21. And for the parents who greeted them, they were told by the Arrows captain that their sons had acquitted themselves with a quiet professionalism of which they could be very proud.
The Church of England Synod has rejected a plan which some people thought could have led to closer unity with the free churches. Provisional approval had been given to the so-called covenant, but this afternoon there was strong enough opposition from the clergy to throw out the plan. Delegates were asked to approve a radical change in Church of England practice. The covenant proposed between themselves and the free churches, the Methodists, United Reformed Church and the Moravians, would have meant joint recognition of bishops and ministers in each other's churches, a major concession by the free churches where ministers are not ordained by bishops. The Church of England, despite its consistent opposition to women priests, would have had to recognise the women ministers of the free church.
On the negative side, the acceptance of women ministers presents serious problems for both Rome and Constantinople, which we mustn't underestimate. While they are perfectly aware that some Anglican provinces ordain women, they still regard the Church of England's stance on this matter as important.
The actor Edgar Harrison, whom millions of radio listeners knew as Dan Archer, was buried today. He'd played the role of the farmer in the Archers series for 13 years. He died last Saturday, aged 75. Graham Purchase reports.
Friends, fellow actors and loved ones were among the mourners at Bristol's St Albans Church, where Edgar Harrison worshipped for some years. They knew him as an actor, but to 3 million regular listeners to the Archers, he was farmer Dan Archer, who drank at the Bull, lost his wife Doris 2 years ago, and suffered a bout of bronchitis in the spring.
We worked together now for 13 years. It was a great blow to me when I heard on Saturday. As a matter of fact, it made me feel quite ill because he was with me on Wednesday. We did a scene together, his last recording.
Many members of the cast, as well as Mr. Harrison's widow, Kay, heard Canon John Smith speak of a personal friend.
He himself really felt that he understood and equated himself in some ways with the man he played. And quite certainly a great number of members of the British public believed, as they listened, that he was Dan Archer.
As The Archers is recorded 6 weeks in advance of transmission, the voice of Edgar Harrison will continue to be heard until the middle of August.
A campaign to abolish boxing is to be launched by the British Medical Association. The BMA's annual representative meeting in London today was told that 337 people had died as a result of injuries in the ring since the Second World War. Calling for the campaign, Dr. Bob Button said boxing is not a sport, but a way of inflicting grievous bodily harm. 2 years ago, Johnny Owen, the British bantamweight champion, went into a coma after being knocked out. He never regained consciousness and died. And Chris Finnegan, a gold medalist in the 1968 Olympics, later turned professional, but his career ended when he went blind in one eye. The British Boxing Board of Control said the BMA decision was remarkable and very wide-sweeping when it's considered that boxing is not the most dangerous of sports by a long way. Well, now soccer, and Bobby Robson has been appointed the new England manager. The announcement was made in Madrid this afternoon by the FA chairman. Robson, who was a stylish midfield player during his days with Fulham and West Bromwich Albion, will start his job immediately at a salary thought to be more than £70,000 a year. Michael Blakey takes a look at his career with Ipswich.